Hello everybody, I am Ben from Team Panic, and today we are looking at the third fight recap for Robot Havok 4. And before we jump into the fights with Vogon Poetry, my overhead saw robot, let's just cover a few little things that happened pre-fight. So the first one is that the ARC arena has now changed. In the past, we were fighting in a long strip third of the arena, because basically the arena was set up so that the middle third lifted and the two outer thirds were used as ant weight arenas. The new configuration changes all of that with two cross beams being put in place and the arena being divided into 4 square ant weight fights. And theoretically we could run 4 fights at the same time, but for Robot Havok we were at Science Alive, there was a crowd around, we were fighting 2 at a time rather than 4, because that would have got a little bit confusing for everyone involved. So yes, new arena, new things changed, which mostly all of us saw that as we got there on the very first day of the event, but it's quite exciting, and it also means that filming it is just that little bit easier now. On top of that, we did some upgrades to Vogon Poetry, or changed some things around with Vogon Poetry very recently, and I kind of redid the whole chassis and everything. And one of the things I wanted to get into that video but did not get here in time was brand new saw blades, which did end up arriving right before the event. Literally the Friday night before the Saturday event, these new saw blades arrived. And the one that is in my hand is a 100mm saw blade with the same tooth depth and diameter as the 50mm blade that I currently have on Vogon Poetry. Along with this 100mm blade, I got 80mm blades, and I also got 50mm blades that also have cutouts so that there's less weight in the blades. Basically, I was doing these A, as an attempt to get more reach with the blades, and also B, as a way of getting more mass back out of the weapon so that I can put it into more things like armor and throwing the saw around on a different motor, essentially, because the servo we're using, not the greatest thing in the world. It could be a lot better than it is. Anyway, in the end, that didn't actually particularly matter that much, because Vogon Poetry was actually underweight by about 10 grams, which I wasn't expecting. So after this event report, we will definitely at some point in the future be building a new version of Vogon Poetry, using up that last little bit of weight that we've got, and also testing out these type of saw blades, and probably doing a whole nother run of those to try and work out the optimal saw blade for an ant weight. Anyway, that is enough yammering on. Let's jump into some fights. And the first fight up is against a robot called Disarm. It is a kind of scoop wedge-shaped robot, done and built and driven by Jaden, who fights Mr. Bojangles, amongst other things. Hasn't been around or hasn't been fighting all that much in the last little while, so it was good to see him return to the sport. Being that it is a big scoopy wedge, I decided to try out one of the larger blades, and rather than go straight for the 100mm blade, I went for an 80mm blade, just to give it a trial and see what would happen.
All right, resume in 3, 2, 1, go.
So that was interesting. The 80mm blade was catching and grabbing much like the big tooth blade that I'd been using, the big tooth 50mm blade that I have around here, which was unfortunate and not something I expected. I expected that being a bigger blade and having the same kind of tooth depth as our 50 tooth blade, that it shouldn't get caught. It would just run and work and be totally okay. However, something about, I'm assuming, the lack of momentum in the blade because of the lack of weight in the blade meant that we were catching and grabbing a lot, and as such, the fight had to be paused 2 whole times for being stuck in disarm and not being able to get the saw blade back out again, no matter how much I wiggled the servo around to try and drop him off the end of the saw. That's alright, in the end it wasn't a huge deal. They just did pause the matches and do the releasing for us. I didn't manage to do too much damage to disarm, especially not to start with, because he was flipped upside down and was feeding me a nice big chunk of 3D printed plastic. We did saw a decent chunk out of that and make some nice big marks, get down through into the infill, but of course there wasn't really anything electrically there to hit. So kind of seeing that, I had really the only option was to go around the side and try and go for the wheels, which I did end up getting one, but not like really well. It did jam up a little bit, but didn't hamper his movement quite as much as it probably could have, and so we had to finish the job by dumping him down the pit, which is one of those things when I'm driving a sawbot like this, I tend to forget about the pit a whole lot until it gets to a point where, like, okay, the saw blade isn't going to finish the job here, so I need another option, and that's when I remember that the pit is there and actually try and force somebody down it. So, moving on to the next fight, we are going up against Blade Tip, which is a robot fairly specifically designed to stop spinners. Thankfully, we're not a traditional spinner in that kind of sense, and their top armor is quite thin. This is a robot built by Steve and driven by his son, Owen.
3, 2, 1, go!
So it might not have been obvious in that clip, but we were running the smaller 50mm blade with the cutouts. I kind of wanted to see whether it was the lack of mass or if it was a larger radius that was causing us to get stuck in disarm. And this fight kind of proved to me that it's the lack of mass, because this 50mm blade is basically identical to the store-bought 50mm blade. It just has cutouts in it, and it still managed to get stuck in blade tip. So that kind of gives me this idea that having that lack of mass in the blades means there's less momentum going into the blades, and therefore it gets stuck and jammed and caught easier, whereas having the higher momentum means that they kind of power through something that the lower weight class blades get stuck in. So that's something interesting to experiment with in the future for sure. Now, this fight was really interesting because if you have a look at blade tip, you see that that top is kind of semi-transparent and there is a nice big orange section just under the lid. That's his battery, his LiPo battery. And standing there and doing that fight, I had the event organizer standing next to me asking me very nicely to not cut the battery in half. So there was a couple of times there where I got a nice grab on the front of him and did not drop the weapon in, because if I was going to drop the weapon in, I would have been nicking the battery. And as we had an audience and it was the first or second fight of that session, they didn't really want a battery to go up in smoke and have to like clear everybody out and clear the arena and all that kind of stuff. So it's something that, like, if I was trying to be really cutthroat, I probably would have just gone for the battery, but as it stands, I have no qualms about not really going for the battery, especially when I was still able to do decent amounts of damage by grabbing from the side and doing cuts in from the side. We got a decent way down in one of those cuts, all the way down to basically his motor, cutting into the motor mount pretty significantly, which was nice. And then the end of the fight was actually interesting because I grabbed from the front again, but my angle was just off so that I could put the saw blade down and not hit that nice orange glaring neon battery that was in there. And doing so, I got some sparks stinging off the saw blade. And it turned out that that was because I cut through the ground wire on his battery. So as soon as the saw was removed, that was it. He had no ground on the battery anymore. It was effectively a new switch point and he turned off, which was really cool. That's like amazing. I love this overhead saw because it does have that like instant knockout potential. Kind of like Annie in that regard, where I can go for wheels and kind of knock them out that way, but I've got an extra attack vector here where if I get far enough into a robot, I can cut some electronics up and just stop things outright, which is really, really cool. Speaking of stopping things outright, the next fight up is against Drummer Boy, which is a drum robot. And the last time we fought Drummer Boy, we sliced directly through his motor wires that ran into his drive motors and stopped him that way. So this I was feeling a little bit more confident in, but because he had a nice weapon, I did go ahead and throw the old thick blade on because I didn't want a weapon-to-weapon collision to bend and snag one of these nice little cutout blades, because yeah, I have a feeling that a weapon-to-weapon collision on these is going to just warp them to no end.
2, 1, go!
Oh, well, that was a fight that turned rather quickly. So we did pretty well to start with. We managed to grab him from the side and grab him from the front and do some nice cutting into him, as I like to do with Vogon Poetry. And we even got his weapon belt fairly early on in the piece, which is a nice little piece of damage that stops him potentially doing any more damage back to me. But then I had problems. That problem being that I had the weapon arm too far back and I got caught and tilted backwards and tilted over, which is okay. I should have been able to self-right from that position, but rather than focusing on the self-right, I focused on turning away from the wall to kind of face back at him, and doing so caused me to fall over and have the self-righting arm jammed underneath the robot, meaning that it was now no longer doing the thing it was intended to be doing, which is a little bit interesting. I thought in that configuration I should be able to raise the arm back up and force the self-righting arm to hit the floor properly and then be able to like lean over on top of that, but it seems as though I've got the geometry just ever so slightly wrong on that, and it just gets caught and jammed and doesn't allow that self-righting to happen. So again, it's something to do for a future version of Vogon Poetry, is update and readdress that whole self-righting thing so that we don't ever get stuck in this point again where we're running around on one wheel and on the self-righting arm, because that kind of sucks, especially as it causes us to lose this fight because we were upside down a lot and then just got into the pit, because driving upside down with really only one wheel contacting the ground made things very, very difficult to drive. But we're doing well so far. In our round robin bracket, we have got 2 wins and 1 loss so far, and our next fight up is the final one of this round robin bracket, and it is against a robot called 6 Inches, so named because it is a horizontal spinner using a 6-inch ruler as its weapon blade. It is also fully metal construction of some form, so the entire outside of the robot is metal, which I was a little bit worried about trying to actually saw through.
Okay, give me your life. 3, 2, 1, go! Now keep these down to make one up with the drop. 3 drop to the middle down right now. The blue lights. Yeah.
So as you saw, he had some issues getting that weapon going in the first instance, which was kind of nice. I wanted to do a box rush anyway. Didn't quite pull that off as well as I was expecting to or hoping to, but in the end it didn't matter because his weapon didn't get spinning until the much, much later point in that match. That did give me, of course, the opportunity to go in and try and slice through that top plate, but as you can see, this saw is really not designed for metal. It works really well on plastics, as we've seen in previous fights, but in this particular case, I was just skidding along the top, getting little nicks and gouges out of it, removing a bit of paint, but, you know, that was about it, really. Which is unfortunate, but I was kind of expecting that, given that it was a metal top. I wasn't fully expecting to go through it, and if I did, I wasn't expecting to really get too far through it. Anyway, not being able to get through the top armor did leave me in a bit of an interesting position because he was a weird robot to try and grab hold of in the dustpan. A lot of the other opponents we've fought so far fit really, really nicely in the dustpan, but he is much lower and wider and has that kind of long extension on the front to keep the blade out of everything. And yeah, it meant that it put his wheels in a very awkward position for me to saw into. Everybody else, I can kind of grab hold of them and then one wheel is kind of jammed up against my armor and the other wheel I can hit with the saw or something along those lines. Whereas in this case, I kind of had to have him like partially in the scoop and half out of the scoop to try and saw his wheel, which is an awkward place to be in and still gives him some traction on the floor, which means he can try and run away. So, you know, not great on that account. He then did manage to start getting the weapon running during that fight, which was a little bit scary, but thankfully I managed to stop him up a couple of times before he got it really going. And when he did get it really going, he was rather too close to the pit and he vibrated himself in there, and we won this particular fight. So because we won this particular fight, we are now through on into the finals, and the first fight up is against Brastoff and Steve. Steve, of course, the builder of Blade Tip that was driven by his son. Brastoff is his robot with a vertical spinner on it. And the last time we fought Brastoff, it didn't go particularly well for us. He managed to get around the back and put a nice big hole in the back of Vogon Poetry and ended up kind of upside down and no wheels touching the ground in the pit. It was a pretty devastating loss.
Well, let's count this down. 3, 2, 1. Go on, here we go. Put some variable circuitry in there. Alright, that was a clean cut. Alright,
so that was a quick match and a little bit bold on my part, to be perfectly honest. The last time we fought Brastoff, I was very, very hesitant about bringing the weapon down anywhere near his blade, and this time, I don't know what got into me, but I decided that I was going to do away with that. I was going to scoop him from the front, and I was just going to drop the blade and hope that it didn't hit anything. And thankfully, I managed to get my arm over top of his blade and cut into his top armor, which was good because it only took 3 shots, and I did the same thing to Brastoff that I did to Blade Tip. Almost exactly. I cut the black wire out of the battery cable and shut the whole robot down, which is amazing that, and a little bit, I'm sorry to Steve for the fact that I did the same thing to 2 of the robots that he built, which is, yeah, cut through the black wire on the battery. And it was, yeah, it's exactly the same wire too, which is just a little bit mind-blowing, to be perfectly honest. And yeah, really happy with that fight. Came out pretty unscathed, which I was really not expecting to, because as mentioned, Brastoff in the past, that fight has been quite challenging and he has dealt a ton of damage to us. So yeah, I feel like we got off kind of lightly there, and I think that's mostly just because we managed to end this fight so quickly. If that fight had been allowed to go on, I may have needed a spare chassis. So if you're keeping track at home, that means we are up to the finals, and excitingly, we're actually versing a new builder in the finals. This is Hurt Feelings, an undercutter who apparently has been inspired by some of my previous tutorials and built a robot with fairly similar parts, but decided to run an undercutter rather than a vert or a horizontal, which is things that I've built in the past, which is really, really cool to see. It's also been interesting to watch throughout the weekend. Early on in the weekend, it was having weapon issues and not really managing to get bite on things or get the weapon up to speed. But as the weekend progressed, the weapon was hitting hard and dealing a lot of damage to people. So I was actually a little bit nervous going into this one, so much so that I made some modifications, made sure that my front armor was a little bit more attached, made sure that the scoop parts of my front armor were very, very well attached. I really didn't want them going flying. And I left on our nice big thick metallic disc, again kind of fearing that weapon on weapon contact.
let's take this away. 3, 2, 1. Game on. This grand final is underway.
So this was interesting for a couple of reasons. One, I feel like I need better anti-horizontal armor, especially better undercutter protecting armor. Now that we have a very decent undercutter on the scene, Hurt Feelings is a very, very good undercutter. And I need to work on this self-righting issue. A number of times there I was getting stuck up on my own self-righting mechanisms and things, and he capitalized on all of those opportunities. Every time I got stuck, he hit me, and he hit me in a good spot, and it did damage. So much so that, yeah, we lost wheels. I have silicon ripped off one of the tires that I have. It's mostly gone. It probably would have still been moving had it not been fully ripped off the robot, which I probably should have hot glued these wheels in place. I didn't do that, and that was definitely my fault. But I had run it all weekend like that, and it was okay. But obviously, going up against an undercutter, you do need to protect your wheels. And realistically, I should know that better than anyone. I run Annie in the beta weight division. It should be a thing that was on my radar, and I just didn't think about it. But again, he did a very, very good job, especially for a first-time builder and driver in the competition. I was very, very impressed. Towards the end of that fight, he got me upside down, or I was upside down. He kind of tinged the weapon a little bit to get some nice sparks going, which was quite cool and a bit showy for the crowd, which is always a good thing. And then in one of the big hits, he managed to hit the switch, which had popped out of its hot glue mount, and yeah, disabled the switch. So I was out no matter what I wanted to do, which I was in a bad way anyway, because I'd already lost a wheel, and fighting on one wheel I was never really going to be able to get the saw into play, which was a little bit unfortunate. I really wanted a nice taste of his HDPE top armor with a nice little bit of carbon fiber underneath, actually. It would have been interesting to see how the saw went against that whole material stack up. But yeah, no, I just got stuck and got outdriven, and that happens sometimes. However, that of course does mean we got second place for the event with Vogon Poetry, which I am pretty happy with that for the weekend. We did pretty decently, only losing 2 fights out of the whole thing. And I honestly hope that Hurt Feelings comes back in a future meet, because I would love to get some revenge on that robot. That is going to be a good little rivalry to have, I hope, going forward into the future. Yeah, so there we go. That is Vogon Poetry's fights through Robot Havok 4. There is one more video on this series to go, and we are going to be talking about bees, grudge matches, and rumbles, because while I applied with 4 robots for Robot Havok, I ended up fighting 7 robots. So the final video in this series is going to be a bit of a mismatch of things, because it is all of the rest of the robots that I have fought over the weekend going to be up and running and having fights. So I hope to see you there.